Hi, this is Eric White. This is the second in a two-part series of screencasts that are a deep dive into vertical spacing of OpenXML word processing ML documents. If you haven't watched the first part in this two-part series, I encourage you to go watch that first, as this builds directly on all of that information. In this part of the two-part series, I'm going to discuss how to control the spacing between paragraphs. If we go back and look in the OpenXML specification at section 17.3.1.33, we can see that the after attribute is specified in terms of TWIPs also. So we'll go do a little bit of playing around with the before and after attributes now. Here the after attribute is set to 200, and that means 200 TWIPs between paragraphs, and 200 TWIPs is 0.138 inches between the paragraphs. So in other words, about 1/10 of an inch. If I change this value to 1440, this now gives me exactly 1 inch between every paragraph. I'll open test.docx. I'm going to go back and change the line attribute and the line rule attribute to give us values that make our text look good. I'll change it to 276, and I'll change the line rule back to auto. Now let's say that I want exactly 1/4 of an inch between my paragraphs. Then I can change this value to 1440 divided by 4, which is 360. So I'll set this value to 360. And now we have exactly 1/4 inch between our paragraphs. I'm going to change this formatting of the middle paragraph to match the other two paragraphs so that we can see the changes that I'm making between paragraphs more easily. The font and the line attribute don't actually affect us with regards to the spacing between paragraphs. Save it, close it, go back to Visual Studio. It will tell me that this file has changed outside the editor. Do I wish to reload it? And I do. And I'll reformat the XML. This value is the value between paragraphs without regard to the spacing between the lines within the paragraph. So if I change this value to 0 and save it, and then I open up the document, you can see that the spacing between the paragraphs now is exactly the same as the spacing between the lines within the paragraph. Now the next interesting point to make about the before and after attributes is that there is collapsing behavior. What this means is that if there are two paragraphs adjacent to each other, and the paragraph on top has a spacing specified for the after of a certain amount, and the paragraph below has a spacing of before specified for a certain amount, the spacing between those two paragraphs will be the maximum of those two values. This is very similar to how margins collapse in HTML and CSS, that when you specify margins for an element in CSS, there is a collapsing behavior of adjacent block elements in CSS. So let's go play around with that. Now I'm going to go into the document and set some paragraph properties directly on paragraphs. So I'll go grab that paragraph properties from the style part, and I'll paste it here, and I'll paste it here. I'm just going to get rid of these RSID values. We don't care about those right now so that we can see what's going on here in the markup more easily. So in both of these cases, the line is set to 276 and the line rule is set to auto. This is the same as what is inherited from the doc defaults, so I can get rid of that. I'll get rid of that there too. So now I'm going to specify that here, after this paragraph, there should be 1/4 of an inch. So I specify 360 twips. And here, I am going to specify that there is an entire inch before this paragraph. So I'm going to change this attribute to before, and I'm going to change the value to 1,440. And if I save it and open the document, there is in fact exactly 1 inch between those two paragraphs. It's not 1.25 inches. Here I'll show two documents side by side and show that this is the case. So here I have test-copy, which has those two values set as we specified, and in test I'm going to specify here that after is 0 and before is 1440 on the next paragraph. I'll save it, and now I'm going to first of all open test.copy. I'll move this over to the left side, and then I'll open test and move it over, and you can see that there is exactly the same space between those paragraphs, even though in this document the paragraph up here specifies that there is to be 1/4 inch after the paragraph, and this document specifies that there is to be no space after the paragraph. Now let's look at one more element that controls spacing between paragraphs. Here I'm looking at the paragraph properties in the OpenXML specification. If I drop down here and look at this element contextual spacing, it says ignore spacing above and below when using identical styles. This is primarily meant to be used for numbered paragraphs and bulleted paragraphs. In other words, paragraphs that have a list item. If you're interested in exactly how numbered paragraphs and bulleted paragraphs work, you can read this article that I wrote on MSDN some time ago. It explains how to create numbered and bulleted items in detail. So let's take a look at how contextual spacing works. I'm making a new document. I'll call it test 2. I'll add some content. Now I'm going to change these to bulleted items, and I am going to indent 2 of the bulleted items. I'll save this and close it. Let's look at test 2 in Visual Studio. I'll go to the main document part, and I'll see that the main document part is formatted with the list paragraph style. I'll go to the styles part. I'll look for the list paragraph style. We can see that the list paragraph style has the element contextual spacing. I'll remove this, save it, and now when we open test2.docx, we can see that the paragraph spacing is now set to whatever that style specifies, and based on inherited styles and then based on the global defaults. But if I go into the main document part and I enter contextual spacing, put that element there, put it in the paragraph properties of the next one, and put it in the paragraph properties of the next one, and we take a look, and now we can see that the spacing between these first paragraphs is based on the way Word wants to space bulleted items. In other words, there should be no additional space between those paragraphs, but there is space between the 4th and 5th paragraph. This is the main use of the contextual spacing element. There is another way that you can control the spacing between paragraphs, and that's using the after lines and before lines attribute. I'm going back to this document where we're changing the spacing in the global doc default element. And if I change this to after lines, then the unit of measure of this value changes. It's no longer in TWIPs. The value is now specified such that 100 is equal to exactly the space of one line between lines. So if I change this to 100 and I save this document and open it, then you can see here that what it has done is it has effectively created the space of exactly one line between lines. Sometimes this is an easier unit of measure to use than using the TWIPs. So now I can set this to 0, and there will be 0 lines between paragraphs. It's just a different unit of measure that sometimes is easier to calculate based on how you want to set up your document. One point to make about this is that the after lines takes precedence over the after attribute. If after lines is specified, then the after attribute is ignored. So for instance here I'm specifying the after attribute to 1,440 TWIPs, in other words 1 inch between paragraphs, and I'm setting up after lines to be 100, which is the space of one line between paragraphs. I'll save it and look at the document, and we can see that there is in fact just the space of one line between paragraphs. The specific rule is that if after lines is set to 0 or doesn't exist, then it uses the value of after, but if after lines is set to anything other than 0, then it uses the value of after lines. But this is really irrelevant. Here's the main point about this is that you should never write your code to specify both after lines and after. That would just be confusing markup, and there's no good reason for it. Instead, pick one of the two and use it, not both. So I'll remove the after lines. I'll change after to 200 to indicate that I want 200 TWIPs between lines here. And if I go look at the document, it looks the same as when we initially started. At this point, we have covered all of the elements and attributes that you should normally be using when you are controlling vertical spacing in your document. There is one more way to control vertical spacing, and I'm just going to show you what it is. This last way of controlling vertical spacing has to do with conversion of text from the web. That's its only purpose. Here I have a document that is set up to use alt chunk. It has an alt chunk here. Inside this alt chunk there is some HTML. If I open up this document part, then here I can see the alt chunk element that is going to pull in that HTML and insert that HTML content at this point in the document. In other words, at the very beginning of the document. So now I'm going to close it. I'll open this document, and it has some text that it converted from the HTML that was inserted in that alt chunk part. Here I'll make a small change so that it forces Word to save this file when I click the save button, and when it saves this file, it's going to process that alt chunk and save all of this markup as ordinary word processing ML markup. So I'll save it, I'll close it. Now I'm going to drag and drop this document that has alt chunk processed onto Visual Studio. Now if we go look inside the main document part, we see now that this now has ordinary word processing ML markup, but it's got a couple of interesting little things about it. First of all, there is this div ID element here that has a value of this number. We can see what that refers to by looking in the web settings part. And if we look in the web settings part, there are these div elements. I could come over here. I can grab this div ID value. I'll copy it and come to the web settings part, and I'll search and I'll find it. And here is the div element. And what it does is it specifies the margin, left, right, top, and bottom. It specifies div borders and so on. And this is there specifically for converting from HTML to a Word document in such a way that when you save this back as an HTML document, it saves with all of the various attributes that you have in that HTML document. In other words, it enables round tripping with fidelity from the HTML to Word and then back to HTML. If I look here, the style is normal web, and now I'm going to go to the styles part and I'm going to look for normal web. Here is that style, and we can see a couple of other interesting attributes down here in the spacing element. First of all, there is this before auto spacing element and after auto spacing element. And what this means is that it should completely ignore this before value and after value and space things per the contents of that web settings part, where there is this div element that specifies what the various spacings should be. It's interesting that Word writes it like this, but per the specification, if I remove before and after, the document will look exactly the same as it did with those values in there, which it does. Key point about this is that unless you are doing a conversion of HTML to word processing ML and you want to enable high fidelity round tripping back to HTML, you don't want to use the before auto spacing and after auto spacing attributes, and you don't want to use the div element that then points to the div element in the settings part. These are very special purpose elements. Instead, we want to commonly control vertical spacing by using the line and line rule attributes, and by using the before and after attributes if you want to specify the values in TWIPs, or by using the before lines and after lines attributes if you want to specify the values such that 100 means that you're going to have exactly one line between your paragraphs, 200 means you are double spacing the paragraph, and so on. Well, that's all I'm going to cover in this two-part screencast series. It's a lot of information, but I wanted to cover vertical spacing of word processing ML documents in complete depth. Make sure that you come over to openxmldeveloper.org and explore all of the OpenXML content that is available there. And if you're interested in what I'm doing personally, then you can also come to my blog at ericwhite.com. Feel free to follow me and OpenXML Dev on Twitter.